All right, everybody. So today on the podcast, we have Milo Wolf. How we doing, Milo?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, man. So I guess I first saw you, it was a while back, maybe a year ago, because you were with RP, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And then now are you with another group? Are you solo?
Yeah. So technically, I'm also working for Strong by Science now as a
Okay.
coach. But the way that deal is set up is if you're a coach for Strong by Science, you can also do your own thing and coach for any other number of companies, including your own. So it's a very nice job in the sense that, just because you're tied to Strong by Science doesn't mean you're exclusively a Strong by Science coach.
Gotcha. Nice. Okay, cool. And I think I saw you maybe, but probably around the same time I was first introduced to you. I saw competition pictures. So just for a little background for people who are newly introduced to you, how long have you been lifting? How long have you been competing?
Yeah. So I've been lifting for around 8 years now. Started when I was 14. I'm 22 now. Um, I've competed in both powerlifting and bodybuilding once. Both of them I mostly did to get the experience of it and see whether or not I enjoyed it. I would say I'm a bit better suited to bodybuilding, and I did my first comp pretty much exactly a year ago now. It was in
Hmm.
October 2021. And yeah, that's kind of my background as far as lifting goes. And on the side, I'm also a coach. I've been coaching for around 4 years, and I'm doing my PhD in sports science, as I'm sure we'll discuss later,
For
on the
sure.
effects of range of motion on strength and hypertrophy.
Right. Cool. Cool. And you look like a pretty tall guy. How tall are you and what did you compete at?
I'm 6'2", so I competed in men's bodybuilding open in the tall class.
Gotcha. Okay. And what weight did you come in at?
So I wasn't. I did a bod pod a few days before my show, and I was like 4.8%.
Hmm.
But realistically, to be like my best stage condition, I was probably like eh, at least 5 pounds off true stage condition. Like I had
Really?
some striations on my glutes, but I wasn't like fully strided and everything.
Sure.
But I came in at 200 pounds on stage at 6'2".
Wow. Yeah, that's a big guy, man. Damn.
Thank you,
Be
thank
on
you.
stage at that size. It's so funny that now these days it's like, well, I had striated glutes, but they weren't striated enough. It's just like the different level of conditioning.
Dude, 100%. And it's funny you say that because I was speaking to Mike Israetel, for example, and I sent him some show pics and everything. And he asked me, was the show tested? Because in the UK, there are so few shows going on, especially with big name federations like the WNBF. That was the first show the WNBF ever did in the UK. There's so few shows that the standard, especially post COVID, where for a long time there were no shows, the standard in the UK for shows is quite high.
Hmm.
And so, like, on stage, I was up against people who all had very top tier level conditioning, and who, like, I genuinely believe would do really well on the national stage. So it was humbling, let's say.
Yeah, yeah. Now in the UK, I guess because since Mike was asking about if it was tested or not, are performance enhancing drugs legal over there?
Yes. So for personal use, as long as you have under a certain amount in your possession, I think they're legal.
Okay.
Um, I will say the WNBF does a great job of testing.
Hmm.
So what they do is I think they test 1/3 of all competitors randomly. And on top of that, they test all the winners of every class at the show. So I got tested actually, and I came out natty. So that's always
There you go.
comforting. But
Yeah,
yeah,
right.
they do a very good job.
Cool, cool. So I guess the way we got introduced was you were on the podcast with Brian Borstein and Alex Straker, and they were talking about my calf experiment, right? And this has been mentioned a few times where after I don't know, because now I've been lifting for probably 18 years. So after maybe 15 years, I was like, all right, so stuff is just not really working here. Let's just see what happens. So I stopped training my left calf, which is now going on probably over 2 years. I have to look at the exact date. And basically there's been no change. Literally to like the 16th of an inch, it's exactly the same. And I think I tagged you on Instagram, and I believe your direct quote was, "You have no idea what you're doing. You don't know how to train calves, and you need to buy my calf training program and get me on the podcast." Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, I think it was a bit more inflammatory in my response. I called you a few slurs as well, but
This is a
you got the
PG
gist of it.
podcast, so I try to keep it tame.
Very good.
So,
I keep it in mind.
so I guess you were surprised, which I was surprised too. I mean, I knew the calves were very stubborn for me, but even I'm surprised that literally just stopping training hasn't, changed anything. Now, I will say I do intervals usually like twice a week. We all know that, muscle in general is easier to maintain than it is to build. So it could just be that my 15-inch calves is just what I built up to. And now through my other leg work, through, the occasional running or biking, it's just enough stimulus to maintain it, which, is a possibility. But I'm still surprised. And I will say I've done similar experiments with other muscle groups. Like, so for example, my thighs, I was like, okay, well, let's just see how much this or that matters. And so I was doing mostly isolations for my thighs for a while, like quads and hamstrings, and even doing like, the abduction and adduction machines. And then I said, okay, just on my left side, I'm going to add leg press. And you're talking like 3 to 6 sets per week. And after 6 months, there was a little over a half an inch difference there. So clearly, in that case, it did make a difference. And I would have been very surprised if it didn't, right? To have like no sort of pressing volume and everything. So it did make a difference there. And I would imagine with most other muscle groups, it would. So I guess if you want to give some initial thoughts, but I know we'll go back and forth a lot on that.
Yeah. So honestly, first of all, that's a pretty crazy approach to take to test out an idea. So props to you for that.
Yeah.
With regards to calves being influenced genetically, because I think that's where we'll wind up going with this discussion.
Yep.
I think it's interesting to note the difference between muscle bellies and muscle size, right? So like how a muscle is shaped for an individual can make a big impact on how big it looks or how impressive it looks. I mean, the calves are a common example where you see untrained people walking around with calves that look absolutely massive that, you could never achieve with your puny 15-inch natty ceiling for your calves.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the same also goes for other muscle groups, right? Like you all know a person who in high school just has bulging biceps and you're like, dude, you've never even lifted a weight. Why do you have those? So I think muscle bellies and fat storage can really impact the appearance of stuff. Oftentimes, like when I've measured, for example, I've got a friend who competes in physique and he's always had just crazy muscle bellies and has always been pretty lean. And from the looks of it, you think, dude, you're jacked. So like you have at least 18-inch arms and so forth. But then when you measure him, his arms are actually like 16 inches. And oftentimes muscle bellies can give the impression of being quite large when in reality they're not quite as large. So with impressive calves, like with impressive biceps in untrained people, I think it can often be a combination of some predisposition towards having bigger calves by nature, some predisposition towards having good muscle bellies. And finally, for men especially, for women as well, the calves aren't a place where people store a lot of fat, no matter what sort of body weight they get to. So men typically store a lot of fat around their midsection, right? They have sort of the apple, quote unquote, fat distribution, which means generally their arms and legs are relatively lean, especially as you get closer to the far out extremities, like for example, your forearms and your calves. And so I think those three factors together explain a lot of why the calves might look big on some untrained person, but for some people just don't seem to get much bigger or what have you.
So I definitely think the muscle belly argument is valid. If you know Abel Chabai, he and I both have 15-inch calves. His might be like 15 and a quarter. But if you were to look at him, you would not even just say he has average calves. You would say he has solid calves. And his limbs in general, even though we're almost the same height, his limbs in general are much shorter than mine. We actually measured just from our hip to our, to the bottom of our feet. And even though we're both about 6'1", I had, I think, 2.5 inches of length on him there, which is pretty substantial. So that combined with just a lower insertion for him, it makes a dramatic difference in how they appear. So I do agree with that. And I would also say that in asking people's measurements and whatnot, a lot of people who you might think like, man, this guy's arms look so big or his calves look so big, they're oftentimes, unless the person's a pretty serious lifter, it's rare that the measurements are above 16 inches or so. Like sometimes some guys I see with great calves, it's like, oh, it's 15.5 inches, So I definitely do agree that that's a big part of it. I still, as you mentioned, though, see some pretty extremes where I personally, I don't know of anybody I can think of that they literally do not work out. They're just an inactive person and they just have amazing arms, just standout crazy arms. But I have seen some and sometimes it's like a toe walker, right? So maybe there's an influence there, but just 13 or 12-inch arms and absurdly big calves. And it's just like, what is going on there that it's such a discrepancy?
Yeah, so I think it boils down to what you potentially mentioned earlier as to why your left calf, is that the way you're not training? Mm-hmm. Or your right calf?
Yep.
As to why your left calf might have maintained pretty well. I do think, especially with sprinting, for example, the forces you expose your calves to are relatively large, and there is some concentric and eccentric actions going on. And the range of motion you take your calves through isn't small either. So it's not as though it's like an isometric contraction with not much load. Now, do I think that would be enough to grow your calves maximally? No, I think the people with amazing calf genetics who just have good calves without training with weights would have even better calves with weights. Like, for example, the only person that comes to mind now is Jared Fellow, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very good muscle bellies for the calves. But his calves have gotten substantially bigger as he trained with weights, but they already looked impressive before he started lifting, right? So I think it's a combination of day-to-day and general sporting activities being somewhat effective for hypertrophy of the calves, with people having great muscle bellies for the calves sometimes. Those two together, I think, explain why you see people walking around with calves better than mine will ever be.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I guess, there's no, something I kind of, you were saying how the walking and with high body weights can make a substantial difference. And I said, well, it's somewhat jokingly, but I was like, imagine if we said that about any other muscle group, like, okay, well, with biceps, you're going to do partials to a 1000 RIR, right? Like nobody would say, well, that's going to get somebody huge biceps. We don't really have that experiment, maybe if somebody was super blessed. And I guess one kind of example of that, not really, but you do see on average, like construction workers and whatnot tend to have a little bit more muscle mass, even though nothing they're doing is remotely close to failure. Do you remember Chad Waterbury from T Nation? He might have been before your time.
Yeah, I think before my time.
Yeah, this was like at least a decade ago. And he was big on full body training, super high frequency training. And he would always talk about, like, look at these gymnasts, look at these construction workers. And I don't totally obviously agree with the methodology there, but the concept I think is relatively sound, that you see people who are doing something a lot, and like you said, maybe it's not maximally developed, but you'll see certain body parts develop just by high volume and repetition, even if it's relatively low intensity. So I don't think it's invalid, I should say.
Yeah, so I think there's some truth there. I think there's two things to keep in mind. The first is with untrained people, right? People who've never lifted a weight and so forth. People often overestimate what sort of training it takes to get any sort of adaptation going. If you ever train a beginner, like complete beginner, honestly, even a set to 10 reps away, 15 reps away, 20 reps away from failure might be enough to cause some decent growth. And so when you combine that with, say, sporting activities that you've never been exposed to, novelty might play a role as well. That might just be enough to cause some growth, even though it's, as you said, 1,000 reps away from failure, or what have you. Mm-hmm. I think that somewhat explains things for leaner people, but it especially explains it with overweight or obese people, in that with sufficiently overweight or obese people, walking becomes actually pretty difficult, like the load involved isn't negligible anymore. Oftentimes overweight and obese individuals might be quite sedentary, and so they're not exactly used to walking either. So it's also some novelty. It's it being kind of close to failure at that point. And as I said, the range of motion involved and the forces involved might not be so negligible anymore. So I think for overweight or obese people that then eventually lose weight, that might be part of it. Maybe they're just able to maintain their calves pretty well as they lose that body fat that they've been keeping on top of their sizable calves already. As I said, I think there is some element that's difficult to explain as to why calves might be more genetically predisposed than other muscle groups.
Yeah. And I was trying to think about a good way to verbalize this concept. But one thing I was trying to think out, and it would actually be in favor of your argument or Schoenfeld's argument, who said that if there's not a difference in the genetics there, would be if you were to imagine, let's say your arms could grow to 18 inches, at your genetic peak, but your calves could grow to, let's say, 15 inches. I guess you could make an argument that they are more stubborn, but maybe you could get like the percentage of maximal growth could be the same for both along the way. So even though it stays smaller, so you feel like this is more genetically influenced, and I guess you could make an argument as well to counter that by not having as much potential for growth, that is inherently a greater genetic influence, i.e. closer to its start. But you could also say, well, each one is now 70% maxed out, or each one is 80% maxed out, which would argue that it's not necessarily genetically influenced. I don't know if I'm verbalizing that correctly, but hopefully that comes across.
No, you're making a lot of sense. I think that's true. And I also think, let's conceptualize it this way. Let's say you have a genetic ceiling for your arms and for your calves, right? But your day-to-day activities take your calves closer to failure than your arms. Like most of the time, your arms don't get anywhere close to failure, just doing like, sitting at your desk, working and so forth. Whereas walking around stuff, your calves might get some stimulus. So by the time you first set foot in the gym, your calves might just be like early intermediates or intermediates, whereas your arms are complete beginners. So proportionately, progress is going to be slower on the calves than for other muscle groups. I think that might be part of why people often think calves don't grow upon being trained, because they're proportionately more advanced than other muscle groups would be.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. So I just have one, I guess, story, and then we'll wrap up the calf topic. But I was on, I've been on the forums forever, since I was 13. And I remember like this guy basically wanted to kick me out of his group because I was kind of argumentative about something. And there was this one guy, clearly, very genetically blessed when it came to calves. And he was given, he's like, oh, this is my secret of how I do it. It's the same stuff you always hear. I'll just hold the stretch a little bit. And this is why I have like 20-inch calves. And the guy who said that I was so like too pessimistic and like a negative, this guy, because I was saying, this is mostly going to be based on genetics. Like some people just aren't going to ever have calves like yours, etc. And the guy who was upset with me was a professional bodybuilder who was enhanced and had the skinniest like stick calves I've ever seen, and had literally used, like was open about it, had used IGF-1 directly into his calves, had used Synthol directly into his calves, and it still just was not working for him. Like, I mean, I'm talking 13 to 14-inch calves on a professional bodybuilder. So, and I was like, bro, how are you going to tell me that I'm too negative when I'm looking at like these real world results? So I sometimes, see, because you're not denying genetic influence overall. You're just saying maybe the calves aren't, more. Whereas this guy was like, I just didn't understand the delusion. But if you've seen any of my podcasts, I think a lot of bodybuilders have some delusional thoughts. So it was just very interesting to see that like happening in real time.
Yeah, I was going to say, this might actually be interesting to listeners. As part of my PhD, I'm doing one study on the calves where I'm having people train one calf with a full range of motion and their other calf with a partial range of motion to see what produces better hypertrophy and strength outcomes. And as part of that study, I'm using the ultrasound to measure hypertrophy. Upon measuring, I don't know, a dozen people now, what I've come to realize, and I knew this before because people had told me, but it's very obvious when you do the ultrasounding yourself, people's shape for their calves differs widely. I've had people who their calf sort of ends 50% down their tibia, and people whose calves end like 35% down their tibia. Like for some people, the reading would be very consistent. At 50%, you'd still see the calf pretty clearly, the gastroc. For other people at 50%, you could barely even see there was a calf anymore. Wow. So there's a wide variety of like higher calf insertions, lower calf insertions, and that can play a pretty big role in how they look visually. Yeah.
I know there's similar models in rodents, and I was joking to Scott Stevenson, if you know him, about so I'm a dentist, and so there are times where like either for TMJ or whatever reasons we'll do Botox, and I've joked about like if I had Botoxed my left calf and just totally knocked it out, would my right calf compensate? Or you see that in where they'll knock out like the soleus, will the gastroc grow and whatnot? Like how extreme do we have to get to see some right calf growth?
Yeah, the studies where they knock out certain genes and stuff like that in rodents are also always pretty wild to me, because imagine doing that with humans.
Yeah. So you mentioned your PhD. So go into a little more detail there. What year are you in studying that, and what are you looking at?
Sure. So I'm currently entering my third year of the PhD. I started 2 years ago. I'm doing my PhD on the effects of range of motion on muscle growth and strength. As part of my PhD, I've got 4 studies. The first one was a meta-analysis on the existing literature on range of motion and hypertrophy, strength, power, sport outcomes, basically every outcome we could care about. Specifically, I geared it slightly more towards hypertrophy and strength, just because I've got several interests there. Like personally, I want to get jacked and strong. So we did a lot of cool sub-analyses, like looking at what's better for hypertrophy, a full range of motion set, a partial range of motion set at long muscle lengths, a partial range of motion set at short muscle lengths, and so forth. We did a lot of cool sub-analyses to answer different questions. Obviously, with a lot of these questions and a lot of these analyses, you've got to keep in mind there's not that much data yet. So even the results of the analyses should be viewed as like, oh, maybe it's that way and it's likely, but not like this is definitely how it is. So that's the first study. Then I conducted 2 other studies, one survey study and one interview study, where I asked for the survey study, just people training for muscle growth or strength, what they thought about range of motion in terms of how they applied it, how much range of motion they trained with, why they trained with that range of motion, what sources of information they use for the range of motion practices. Like, do you train that way because you see other people training that way, because you read the evidence, because of, a variety of things. So that was helpful. Then the interview study was interviewing physique and strength athletes and coaches about their use of range of motion within the physique and strength sports to see how, so recreationally, in the survey, I got around 750 people, which is a lot of people. And that gave us a pretty good idea of what people at large do with regards to range of motion when training for muscle and strength. And then the interview was more so geared towards getting competitive opinions within the physique and strength sports on what they think of range of motion. And then finally, the last study, which I'm currently starting, like right now in a week or 2, I should start data collection, is having people train their calves separately. So one calf is training using a partial range of motion, likely half the full range of motion in the lengthened part, so when it's more stretched out, and the other calf using a full range of motion for 10 weeks, 2 sessions a week, and seeing which calf sees greater hypertrophy and or strength adaptations following the intervention. And the good thing within subject design is that you can wash out a lot of stuff like nutritional differences between people, sleep, stress, PEDs, and so forth, because it's the same people. They just have 2 legs, and we're comparing the 2 legs.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that when you can do it with the same person. And as I've mentioned with my own experiments, I've said before, you can tell me if you agree, but I feel like something I don't really hear anybody talk about, and I could see issues with it practically, is that if you're wondering if a certain method works, assuming, like you couldn't do, okay, I'm going to do like West Side barbell training on my right arm and then, like a bodybuilder program on my left. But as far as like within reasonable variations, like I want to see if high volume is something that I respond to. I could understand as like certainly a beginner intermediate, like not wanting to waste the time. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, but I think if you were curious, you could say, I'm going to do X thing for one side and just see if I have any difference after 3 months. And if I have literally no difference, and maybe it's not worth my time. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So there's pros and cons, right? The pro is that essentially you as an individual, you're trying to figure out what works for you, because studies ultimately are only going to inform you about the average person. You might be different from the average, and until we have some way of knowing how different you are or in what ways you're different, if you take the studies and the results from studies and apply them to your own training, you might be missing out on individualization initially. And the only way to really figure out how it should be different for your training is to experiment by yourself, right? But the degree to which you're suggesting experimenting comes at the expense of potential progress, right? Because like with one person, it's very difficult to tell if something works better. Because with one person, you're taking one measurement every time. It's just not enough data to see if it's consistently better or worse. The sample size is just really small.
Mm-hmm.
And the measurement methods you as an individual have access to are quite rudimentary usually, like especially for hypertrophy. Sure, you can use a tape measure, but tape measurements have a relatively high measurement error, right? And so especially when dealing with a single person, the benefit of using a study as a jump-off point is that there is more data and more reliable means of measurement. And so while you might be slightly different from the average, just by the nature of how averages work, you're likely pretty similar to the average person. And so it's a good jumping off point. And from there, I think you can experiment with roughly equally likely to be good protocols. Like, for example, a full range of motion versus a pretty full range of motion, and see what works better for you. But then the issue with such similar differences in training, right, for one leg versus the other, for example, is that the difference in outcome might also be so small that it's hard to tell,
Sure. Yeah, I think realistically, like if you told me to try one of these experiments 7 years in, I just wouldn't have done it. I'm like, well, I'm just trying to get everything ideal right now. It was one practical problem. And then the other thing is when you are advanced, as you alluded to, the results are going to be so slow. It's kind of hard to say, well, can you even tell there's a difference? Like it might take 6 months or more to even notice, which, on that note is why I have a problem sometimes when I see some people who've been training 10 plus years and they do something like some small difference and they're saying it's this major game changer. And it's like, how are you going to say it's a major game changer when, I mean, certain things could be, but like, oh, this one exercise variation changed everything. And it's like, come on, man.
100%. When you see people say, "Oh, deadlifts, for example, build your back a lot," it's like, okay, and they're like, "Yeah, so Dorian did deadlifts, and he had a really thick, dense back." Yeah, Dorian did a lot of other exercises too. He did a lot of other stuff as far as PEDs and stuff go. He had his own genetics. There's so many confounders that trying to claim that this one tweak in exercise technique or mind-muscle connection or exercise selection even is going to revolutionize your training it's absurd, especially when you consider so training has an effect that's about this big, right? Let's say genetics has an effect that's about as big probably. And then if you subdivide the effect that training has on muscle growth into all of its components, right? So there's volume, there's frequency, there's intensity, there's repetition range, there's exercise selection. There's so many factors that for you to claim that this one tweak really made a big difference, and using like an anecdote, like for example, I don't know, successful bodybuilders of the past, like unless there's the preponderance of them did this thing and saw success.
Right.
Unless that's the case, if you're just using a few, it's a losing argument in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And, we could certainly go down the nihilistic rabbit hole there, but it does make me wonder. I mean, that's most of this industry, right? It's just like, well, try this thing. And it's like, how do you know? How do you know that is going to make any difference for an individual, but even just overall? That's why, for people who listen to the channel, it's not that I want to come across as like nothing matters, but I do believe, like you said, I think genetics are at least as important as the training aspect. And when you break down some of these small subcategories within training, like it used to be, I think I was just talking about, who was I talking to? So it's one other guy recently. And I was saying how, once upon a time, there were so many articles on like the perfect split. And I don't see people talk about that too much anymore, but it was like, man, once I changed to this split, and it's like, so now you're talking literally everything else is the same, including like the exercises you're doing. You're just splitting something differently. It's like, this was the game changer, or I'm thinking of a specific name. I guess I'll leave his name out, but just a lot of examples of it,
Yeah, it's appealing as an idea, right? Because it's the quick fix. So people like to buy into it and it's easy to sell to people as well. But ultimately, that one small change, you're, in this case, you're changing only the distribution of exercises and volume across the week, but the weekly volume, the weekly exercises and so forth, they all stay the same. It's never going to make a big difference to your results, unless you're at one extreme, like doing all of your training within an hour in the week, moving to actually doing it reasonably across 5 days a week, for example. Unless you're going from one extreme to a more reasonable point, if you're making a small tweak to something, in all likelihood, A, you don't know that it's going to have an effect, and B, even if it does have an effect, it's going to be a very, very small one and probably undetectable.
Do you think that, to me, I feel like it's almost an unsolvable problem in the industry, because the whole industry has to function on getting people invested. Everything on, I don't have a TikTok, but I get people send them to me, or like on Instagram, you almost necessarily, if you want to do well, have to make it sound like your services or your product are going to make a big difference. Because if not, it's like, well, here, just read this book from like 1995. It's going to be 98% accurate as far as what you need to do. As somebody who's directly in the field, I mean, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so as you said, I think with a lot of industries like the food industry or dentistry or what have you, there is almost an inherent need for it, right? Because for health reasons or what have you. With fitness, a lot of people in the industry try to create a need so that then they can sell the fix for that need, right? So for example, the industry as a whole has, for better or worse, and I think for better for the most part, has glorified getting really jacked, and some people have glorified getting maximally jacked, right? And so offering a solution to, hey, look at you, you're not maximally jacked yet, you're pathetic. Here, try this method that I can sell you and you'll get maximally jacked like I'm telling you to get. I think creating the need for, first creating uncertainty and the need for getting more muscular or getting this adaptation or what have you, and then selling them the solution. I've kind of had the same experience where people really cling on to ideas right? So I'm doing my research on range of motion, and as part of that, one big theme that's emerged. And prior to the PhD, honestly, my bias probably was going into it was that full range of motion was best. But I've tried really hard throughout that the PhD to remain open to other possibilities. And so what came out during the PhD as a whole was that training at long muscle lengths is productive for hypertrophy. And in general, from the response I've gotten from people, having an idea out there that's your own, like the long muscle length stuff, people love to latch onto that idea. And I don't know, maybe I'm guilty too of selling a fix to a need, right? Because long muscle length is a new thing. You know, it's a new hot thing on the block now.
Right.
Everyone wants to try it so they can maximize their hypertrophy. So I think people are generally looking for quick fixes, and the needs are created by the industry as a whole and by people wanting to get more jacked. But oftentimes these quick fixes, these new ideas, like I'm not saying that training at long muscle length is going to take you from looking like the average person on the street to Ronnie Coleman in 2 weeks. It might make a small difference, and that's my best guess based on the evidence. But I'm never going to market it as being like, incorporate this in your training and you'll see the results you always wanted, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the issue, is the emphasis on degree. And I don't see a solution to it, because I would not expect trainers and whatnot to preempt every video saying, hey, just so you know, this tip I'm about to give you makes almost no difference. This nutrition advice I'm going to give you makes almost no difference. Like, it would be kind of silly. I think the problems comes when you get, again, mostly beginner to intermediate effects, where you get that whole Dunning-Kruger effect, where people will see, they'll think, wow, that person is an idiot. Look at them. They're not even training with, this method. And I mean, when I was young, I used to think that too. I was like, look at the football team. And like, I remember thinking like, wow, like I could program better than them, and I was like 1 year into training. And it's just because, and I mean, not that they were following that sound of a program, but it was fine, it was working fine. And I think as long as people understand the degree of magnitude, it's not an issue to try for these little things. I would never say that, but just don't think that like somebody's an idiot because they're using like a bro split. Like, you can still get massive using a bro split, right? There's plenty of, things that are fine.
Yeah. To be honest, I think it is mostly on the people making the videos, making the content and so forth, to try and have a bit of integrity regarding the magnitude of the effects they're talking about, right? So like whenever I go on a podcast nowadays and talk about range of motion or muscle length or what have you on hypertrophy, I try and make it clear that the effects we're talking about are trivial to small. That is literally the magnitude of effects we're talking about. And that ultimately the vast majority of your results just come from training pretty consistently over years and years. And whether you're using a full range of motion or you're doing partials at low muscle lengths, ultimately the effect between the two the difference isn't going to be that large. I think this is the thing with science communication, right? You got to make it interesting to people, because otherwise people won't watch it, and then science just gets left in the dust, and it's just like archived in some database, and it gets 5 reads over 10 years, which is the reality for a lot of papers nowadays. So you got to be communicating the science somehow, but you also want to have the integrity of not claiming the effects are outrageous. So there's got to be like a bridge, like for example, you're doing a good job with communicating science. Another one is Jeff Nippard, right? Jeff Nippard makes videos on the evidence that's out there, and he generally does a pretty good job of communicating how important different aspects of fitness are, or your training are, your nutrition are. And I think that's really important, because otherwise everything gets hyperbolic, Like you see this person talk about this tweak to your technique, or this back exercise that just got invented 2 weeks ago that's now going to revolutionize your training based on EMG data that only the person creating it has access to. Right. Eventually we have to stop being hyperbolic, so that hopefully the industry can come to a bit more of a reasonable point in terms of estimating how big of an effect different things have. Yeah,
sure. You had touched on, well, when you first came into your PhD, you had the bias of full range of motion. I know now there's more talk about these like lengthened sets and whatnot. So has your opinion changed, or what are some of the conclusions you're seeing in the research you're doing?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, we did a meta-analysis and systematic review on range of motion and the effects it has on hypertrophy, strength, power, sport outcomes, body fat, etc. With regards to hypertrophy and strength, that's what I'll focus on. With strength, it's pretty straightforward. what we did is we categorized performance outcomes, so that's power outcomes, sport outcomes, and strength outcomes, into being either biased towards a full range of motion or a partial range of motion. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're an isometric, right? An isometric, if you were training with a full range of motion or a partial range of motion, it doesn't really matter because neither of them is specific to the isometric contraction. It's not the same thing you're doing, you know? But if, for example, the outcome you're testing for strength is a full range of motion 1 rep max, then inherently the group training using full range of motion squats had an advantage over the partial range of motion condition, right? Because they were being more specific. And so when we categorized outcomes as being either biased towards a partial range of motion condition or a full range of motion condition, what we saw is that training in the range of motion that you want to become better in, whether that's for like a sport outcome like a sprint, or whether it's a full range of motion squat or a partial range of motion squat, training that range of motion consistently seems to increase how much of an improvement you see. So if you want to get good at full range of motion squats, do full range of motion squats for the most part, right? So be pretty specific in your training with regards to range of motion for performance outcomes. Now with hypertrophy, and that's where my personal interest mostly lies, it seems like the muscle length at which you perform partial repetitions influences how much hypertrophy you get. So generally, partial repetitions at short muscle lengths, think the top of the bicep curl, right, where your biceps are very shortened, those don't seem to be as good for hypertrophy as either full range of motion reps or partial reps at long muscle lengths, like the bottom of a bicep curl where your bicep is quite stretched out. Full range of motion reps seem to be slightly worse, based on the data we have now, than partial range of motion reps at long muscle lengths for hypertrophy. Now, we don't have that much data yet on hypertrophy specifically in range of motion, but in general, I think the takeaway here, and this is based not just on the research on range of motion when it's performed with a full range of motion versus partial range of motion, it's not just based on that, but also on the isometric literature, where they compare isometric contractions performed at different muscle lengths and the effects on hypertrophy, and also on the literature on partial ranges of motion at different muscle lengths. So there's 6 studies on that now comparing the same range of motion, so let's say 50 degrees range of motion, but performed at shorter or longer muscle lengths. So there's 6 studies there as well, of which 5 show a benefit of longer muscle lengths and 1 shows no difference for hypertrophy. And also the inter-set stretching literature now, like there's some evidence coming out on stretching between sets and stuff like that. And there's some older studies and some newer studies as well. Older studies in animal models where they stretch out, for example, birds' wings for a long time and saw hyperplasia, so fiber addition. So usually with hypertrophy, you have a set number of fibers, muscle fibers, and they just grow in size. So you don't get new fibers, they just grow in size. With hyperplasia, you actually grow new fibers. And so that might be one of the differences between people genetically, is that some people are just born with more fibers and are thus able to get bigger over time. So when you combine the animal studies, there's some new studies in humans as well with similar ideas, but not the hyperplasia, just drastic muscle growth after training at long muscle lengths for a while. The partial range of motion literature, the full range of motion versus partial range of motion literature, and the isometric literature. Overall, the picture emerges that training at long muscle lengths for hypertrophy is really important. And so if I had to say for hypertrophy, a full range of motion is probably only better than a partial range of motion if and when it includes longer muscle lengths on top of the partial range of motion. And I'm open to the idea that partial repetitions at long muscle lengths may actually be more productive for hypertrophy than full range of motion.
Yeah, that I know that classic bird study is always mentioned with stretching. So it's actually convinced me the next week I'm going to take off from work and I'm going to get some straps and just hang from my pull-up bar for about a week. We'll see how that goes. So
very good. Good luck. Let me know how it goes.
Yeah. Regarding the strength aspect, I had thought that I saw something recently. It might have even been by Stronger by Science saying that, the idea was it's specific to the range of motion. So partials, you're going to get stronger at partials. But then I thought I saw something recently that showed that actually full range of motion even improved partials more.
Yeah, there was one study, I believe it's the Polaris et al. Study on the bench.
Yeah, I think that sounds right.
Yeah, that was, so I read that study top to bottom. I think that's the only study, or one of the only studies that's shown that so far. So I wouldn't really read into it too much. I think a full range of motion approach to all your repetitions is a good default approach, right? So if I provided some recommendations in the meta-analysis at the end. If you want one sort of, again, all the effects between partial and full range of motion are trivial to small. So you're probably good with any approach. It won't be optimal, potentially, but it will be good enough for most people. But I think a good default approach, if you're just training for general strength and hypertrophy, is a full range of motion, and that's for a few reasons. Generally, when you grouped outcomes by, for example, hypertrophy outcomes, strength outcomes, sport outcomes, and so forth, directionally, all effect sizes were in favor of full range of motion. They were small, but they were all in favor of full range of motion when all outcomes were grouped and not really, categorized properly. Also, a full range of motion is a lot easier to standardize because if it's full, right? You can keep it consistent pretty easily. If it's partial, unless you have specific landmarks you use, like for example, a machine can have certain stops or certain settings and so forth, a partial range of motion can be harder to standardize and thus can also make it harder to ensure you're training sufficiently close to failure over time or gauging progress as well. And a full range of motion, to an extent, can help you take care of those things as well. So I think a full range of motion approach can be a decent coverall or a decent default approach. But if you're looking to optimize adaptations, you might want to experiment with different approaches depending on your goals.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you can go back and look at a lot of bodybuilders who you wonder, was it an intuition? Was it luck? But a lot of times they would do, especially like a lot of like pressing movements, right? They would do the lengthened partials. And to be honest, like that's kind of where I would say I do 90% range of motion, but I don't try to lock out every rep on like bench press, for example. Even with like my shoulder pressing, I would get close, but to me, it almost feels unnatural to try to get that last 10%, and it just feels smoother, like I'm more in a groove. Less so for back movement, because that's not necessarily true. I think for rows, I do, and I see Brian Borstein talk about this a lot now, but like I do think because to get a full range of motion, and this is something I remember back in high school, I posted up a video and I was doing a barbell row. And all these people were telling me that I could do so much more. And I'm like, well, if I try to use a weight that allows me with like perfect form to bring it to my stomach, I have to use so much lighter weight, right? So just to get, let's say 75% of the way there, I could use way more. So I can see why people, especially on things like rows, there is that inclination to say, well, let's do some of these lengthened partials after the full range of motion kind of goes to failure for that specific range of motion.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I think specifically for muscle groups where the exercises you use are very hard at the peak contraction or don't offer much tension at the lengthened position. So for example, dumbbell lateral raises, right? At the bottom, at the lengthened position, not much tension, if any. At the top, the hardest point, and that's the most contracted point as well. So for those, it would make sense to incorporate some sort of lengthened bias, whether that's pausing at the bottom, for example, in its simplest form, pausing at the fully lengthened position, proportionately allows you to spend more of your set at those lengthened muscle lengths and probably get more hypertrophy that way. Or if you want to be more extreme, what you can do is, for example, do a lengthened, stretched, reverse drop set, whatever you call them nowadays. There's several names out there now, where you take a set with a full range of motion close to failure, or however close to failure you want. And then instead of ending the set there, you continue, but just doing, for example, half reps in the lengthened range, again, to a certain RPE or proximity to failure. Alternatively, you can also just omit the full range of motion altogether and just do partials in the lengthened range. Or if you want to get really crazy, and I'm not actually recommending this necessarily, but you could just do isometric holds in the lengthened position, just enjoy.
Do we have, I don't know, I forget if you mentioned this, but do we have studies showing the isometric was as helpful or more helpful?
So that's a really interesting question. It's a question I keep coming back to because every time I talk about range of motion and long muscle lengths and so forth, isometrics and range of motion are inexorably tied together, right? Because an isometric is literally just no range of motion. A partial range of motion is some range of motion, and a full range of motion is the maximum range of motion. So we don't currently have a systematic review of the effects of isometric contractions on hypertrophy compared to concentric and eccentric and so forth. Fun fact, like half a year back at this point, Mike Israetel commissioned a colleague of mine and myself to write a review on that topic. But to be frank, it's been a very busy half a year, and so we haven't actually gotten around to it basically at all. But that is a topic I'm really interested in. And, the direct evidence we have on isometrics at different muscle lengths also suggests that isometrics at long muscle lengths are better. But whether or not isometrics inherently are better or worse for hypertrophy than dynamic contractions, I wouldn't be able to tell you, right? It's a weird idea because it's always something that's been hanging around the back of people's heads in the fitness industry. oh yeah, we don't do isometrics because they're worse for hypertrophy than dynamic contractions. But whether or not there's any truth to that is something I haven't been able to accurately tell or research myself.
Yeah, it would be interesting. And again, this is based on nothing but feel and intuition. But like when I imagine, again, saying like a barbell bench press or really any variation of bench press, and I imagine doing the bottom half and I do that for 10 reps to failure versus the top half, 10 reps to failure. Like that just inherently feels so much more productive for my chest, right? To have that stretch and doing that, right? I could easily see how a study would show that that would show superior growth. When I imagine instead just having like a locked barbell there and just pushing, I just feel like not a lot is happening. Not that it's not hard. And again, this is just based on like feel. So I'm not saying this is what a study would show. It's just from 18 years of training. I'm like, with this, like when I would finish a set, which I guess you would just have to measure by time, it just doesn't feel very productive to me. I know you would probably get stronger at those isometrics over time. It just, I don't know if you can relate to that or you don't agree.
Yeah, I think I would also imagine that to be not be very stimulative. Like I wouldn't feel it as much as like a dynamic traction, I think. But ultimately, I don't know. As with me having the bias of full range of motion being best going into the PhD, I want to be willing to re-examine my biases as I progress and learn more. And to be frank, I haven't really tried that in the first place. So maybe I'm wrong about even thinking that it wouldn't feel as good, right? So I'm trying to stay open to the idea that it might be possible, but I'm not saying, hey, everyone, stop doing all those full range of motion repetitions, stop dynamic exercise, just go out and do some isometrics, do some dead hangs, do some block pulls against blocks, I guess, and so forth. So
has this changed how you're personally training and have you implemented any of these like intense stretches?
Yeah, so I haven't implemented any isometric contractions only into my training, but I have basically on all exercises now, I pause in lengthened position on every repetition, whether there's tension or not. If there's no tension, like the bottom of a dumbbell lateral raise, it's probably not necessary because it doesn't get you much. But I just do it for standardization's sake. It doesn't really matter because if there's no tension, it's essentially just like resting for a second, right?
Right.
On top of that, for muscle groups like the back, like the side delts, like the biceps, like the calves, and like the abs mostly, and the forearms, where the failure point is pretty much always either moderate or short muscle lengths. I pretty much exclusively now use stretch supersets. So a full range of motion set straight into a partial range of motion set for all my sets. For the chest, tricep, quads, and hamstrings, where you do get a lot of tension at the lengthened position and you get into pretty deep positions as well, right? Like the bottom of an RDL, plenty of tension, and your hamstrings are quite lengthened. Same for the glutes, same for the quads during squats, same for the chest during bench, and so forth. So for those, I don't implement quite as many stretch supersets, but I will do maybe a quarter to a third of my volume with lengthened supersets, just to slightly bias it to longer muscle lengths anyways. And then finally, I haven't actually implemented either any long muscle length isometrics or long muscle length partial sets only yet, but it's something I'd be open to in the future. I just haven't really gotten around to it yet.
Yeah. I don't know how familiar you are with DC training with Dante Trudel, but I did that for a while. I had incorporated these stretches in the past, and then Scott Stevenson had fortitude training, again, incorporated those. And then even more recently did like the full DC program. And they're obviously very intense, very painful. I would say it's so tough because, again, at my stage where nothing's really happening, it doesn't mean that it's anything I do. It doesn't mean it's not working, or it wouldn't work if I was more intermediate, right? But just it's not doing anything necessarily now. And as we talked about at the start of the podcast, even if it made a 3% difference, which would probably be fantastic if it did that, it's like, how am I going to measure that as an individual, doing this 7 years into training? So I'm open to it. I do think studies, there's enough evidence to support it. Something that I have brought up and I've heard other people bring up is that, if you're comparing, let's say, a straight set versus a straight set, then a stretch, it's like, well, that is just more stimulus. What if you had just done a couple more reps, or half set or something? And I don't know if I've really seen that. Like, that's one of my problems with this. Like, I'll see, nothing versus stretch. And it's like, well, yeah, there's now a stimulus. Or I'll see, maybe a set versus a set plus a stretch. And that's even more rare to even find that. But when they do, it's like, well, again, that's technically more volume. So it's still kind of confounded.
Yeah. So that's one limitation with a lot of the range of motion studies and a lot of this reasoning around, for example, doing a stretch superset, is that yes, it's likely more stimulus. For example, doing partials at long muscle lengths might be more stimulating for hypertrophy than a full range of motion set. All things being equal, right? Let's say you take both sets to failure, but maybe the long muscle length set is more fatiguing. So in the studies where they only do, say, 3 sets twice a week, they're not having any issues recovering, right? Because it's 6 sets a week, they're fine. But what if you had enough time to train and you implemented these ideas, and turns out if you're doing lengthened sets only, you can only do 10 sets a week and still recover fine. Whereas if you did full range of motion sets, you could do 15. And so the overall stimulus from those approaches is actually equivalent, all else being equal, right?
Right.
So that's one of the limitations with a lot of these studies. And I think one place you can look to sort of quell some of those concerns would be the fatigue research on long muscle lengths. So there is some evidence out there, to my knowledge, that shows that contractions at long muscle lengths are a bit more fatiguing inherently than contractions at short muscle lengths. Now, it's possible that they are just inherently more fatiguing, right? With all else being equal. My suspicion is that at least part of that difference in fatigability, so how much fatigue contractions at short versus long muscle lengths cause, is down to people generally not being accustomed to contractions at long muscle lengths. So if you walk into your gym, how many people do you really see doing full range of motion reps or at least getting a deep stretch on most exercises? Answer, not that many. Whereas contractions at short muscle lengths, so like a decently peak contraction, quite common. And so my suspicion is that in those studies, at least part of the difference may be explained by the novelty effect, whereby a new stimulus can cause more damage than the same stimulus that's already been that you've already been exposed to at least a few times.
Interesting. That is interesting. I've seen, some research showing, it's kind of always thought that, okay, if a muscle contracts, the whole muscle contracts, and you're going to have uniform growth throughout. Maybe a couple of studies showing that they're actually maybe even within one single muscle group, there are going to be differences in where the growth occurs. I don't know if there's a consensus yet on like, well, this is possible, or maybe those studies are just outliers. So I guess that would be the first thing is, what do you think on that? But then secondly, do you think that would then depend on these range of motion differences you're talking about?
That's a really good question. So we performed an analysis to see whether or not full range of motion and partial range of motion training protocols resulted in different distal versus proximal hypertrophies. It's a plural now. The analysis wasn't highly powered enough, so there wasn't enough data to really say for sure. Based on my systematic reading of the literature on topic, my hunch is that it goes as follows. Contractions or partial range of motion reps at short muscle lengths do a pretty good job of growing you proximally. So let's say, for example, for the quads, right? The proximal insertion point is at the hip, and the distal insertion point is at the knee. So partial range of motion reps at short muscle lengths, they do a pretty good job of growing you near the hip. But at the closer to the knee, not so much. Whereas full range of motion reps and partials at long muscle lengths seem to do a pretty good job of growing you both near the origin point, so near the hips for the quads, but also near the insertion point, so near the knees. So they do a pretty good job, full range of motion repetitions and partials at long muscle lengths. They do a pretty good job of growing you overall, whereas shortened partial range of motion repetitions only seem to grow you pretty well at proximal points and not so much at distal. Now, back in the day, and this was my thinking too a few years ago before I started the PhD, my thinking was that one of the reasons that full range of motion was best for hypertrophy was that it would induce uniform hypertrophy across the whole muscle.
Mm-hmm.
But based on the evidence I've read so far, it is true that a full range of motion promotes pretty uniform hypertrophy most of the time, provided especially you have a variety of exercises in your program so that you can hit it from a variety of angles and so forth. But I think a partial range of motion probably only leads to non-uniform hypertrophy when it's performed at short muscle lengths. So if you're doing partials at long muscle lengths, you just might be covered. I'm very open to that being wrong because, again, not that much data out there yet, but that's my hunch.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, it'd be great if there was more conclusive evidence out there on how much of a difference would it ultimately make? I'd say most of the time, once somebody is even 5 years into doing things correctly, you can kind of see what the general shape is going to be, right? And then they kind of uniformly grow from there for the most part. But it'd be interesting to know, specifically from like a bodybuilding standpoint, when somebody says you got, this area is a little bit weak, if there was ways to say, okay, well, maybe I can actually grow this specific part of this muscle group. I mean, I don't know if I see too many examples of that in the natural world, at least, but it is interesting.
100%. I think for the people who want to sort of theory craft or experiment, they could go out there and do just partial repetitions at short muscle lengths to really bring out the quads near the hips or the triceps near the shoulder or that sort of thing. But yeah, it's an interesting idea. I think it's too early to really consider applying that idea to training yet.
Yeah. So I guess a final question I have for you is more in the realm of the research process itself. One thing we hear about is it's like, okay, I want to have this study. I want to see this study. Why aren't these studies done? And inherently it's like, well, because practically every individual researcher, just I guess stating it bluntly, is probably going to be selfish in that they are going to want maximum publications, right? They're going to want things that show results so that they are more likely to be published. And so oftentimes studies, like I think, again, Stronger by Science podcast just mentioned this with creatine, right? It's like, who wants to do a meta-analysis on like 400 creatine studies when they can do a meta-analysis on like 8 studies on this other topic? And you'll often see people who are trying to get through a PhD, for example, or a master's. It's like, look, I just want to have like my study done, and I want to show that there are results. So I don't care if it's the 5th time or the 10th time this study's been replicated. This other thing is too hard. As somebody who's literally like right in the middle of the process, how much do you feel that pressure to get a publication done versus maybe going into something super novel?
Yeah. So you're 100% right in that there is a lot of effort to push for publication, and that non-significant findings, for example, are much less likely to get published than significant ones. And so as a researcher, especially if researching is your job, right? Like you do it full time, you have to acquire grants for money to do your research and so forth. And your citation index, like how often you get cited by other people and so forth, literally impacts your livelihood. At that point, there's a lot of pressure on you to put out significant findings. And by significant, I mean statistically significant. So what people consider to be true findings, let's say, as opposed to there's nothing actually happening. And generally, journals are more likely to publish your study if it's a significant finding. And that puts people under a lot of pressure to do anything from setting up studies in a way that would lead them to find an effect, all the way to straight up making up the data or making decisions, like, for example, how you analyze the data or how you format it, which subject to include or not, that sort of stuff. Like, there's, from the outside, if you're not accustomed to reading research, doing research, and so forth, you can think of science as being like a monolith of truth, right? In reality, a much more apt analogy for doing research is it's very much a garden of forking paths. So you have so many decisions to make during the research process that if you really wanted to, you could find the result you want to find pretty easily. And so it's really important as a researcher to approach things with, so I'm lucky in that my PhD is self-funded. So I pay to do my PhD, I'm not getting paid to do it, which means I can do the topic I care about, which is range of motion. But it also means, fortunately, that I don't really have a vested interest in finding significant results. If my study on calves, for example, finds that there's no difference, I'd be like, that's kind of cool. I guess it adds to the body of evidence overall. And overall, the body of evidence still suggests that long muscle lengths are good for hypertrophy. It maybe takes it away from that conclusion a tiny bit, like it shifts it slightly, but it doesn't really matter to me what the study's outcome is exactly. And so I think because sports science is quite underfunded as well, like, studies are hard work. We don't have much funding because, unfortunately, priorities in the world right now are not to get us jacked. It's more so to get us to live long lives, which I disagree with, but
right.
Semantics. So, yeah, I think as I said earlier, I've tried to not be biased throughout the research process. I've tried to be to collect data in a way that wouldn't influence the findings either. And ultimately, I'm doing this research because I care about it. I care about finding out the truth, and not because I'm trying to make a living off of being a researcher, which I think is a good position to be in to conduct trustworthy research.
Yeah. I mean, of course, it's always hard to take out the bias, but when you can do it as well as possible and be cognizant that it exists, and obviously that's helpful. Cool, man. Well, I thought this was a great talk. I'm going to go on an hour. I want to be respectful of your time, but I'm sure we'll be talking in the future. So for people who are newly introduced to you, where can they find more of your stuff?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much for having me on. It was an honor. I've been listening to your stuff, and I can't pronounce his last name. I heard you pronounce it earlier. I was like, wow, That's how you pronounce it? I
used to say it was, I don't even know how I used to say it now. I used to say Chabai, and then I had a Hungarian patient tell me it was Chabai. And even that, I don't know if I'm totally correct, but I know I'm closer.
Anyways, thank you for having me on. You can find me on Instagram at Wolf Coach. So that's my last name, Wolf and Coach. I have a website called wolfcoaching.net where you can find my coaching stuff. I'm also a coach for Strong by Science. So if you want to get some coaching through Strong by Science, that's fine too. I'm actually starting a podcast with a colleague of mine, the one I'm doing the systematic review on isometrics versus concentrics and so forth on, and who's also a PhD in sports science. And that's going to be called Muscle and Feels, as a play on muscle and fitness. So that's on YouTube as well, starting in a few days. And yeah, I think that's mostly it. If you want to find my research, I have a ResearchGate profile. So ResearchGate Milo Wolf, and you'll find it. And that's about it, I think.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks again.
Thank you very much.